All right, it looks like we're at the hour. Welcome everyone to our Guava and Osterman Research webinar today, Why Migrating to Archiving 2.0 Solution is Necessary. My name is Q Mangus. I'm the Director of Product Marketing here at Guava. We have quite a few people here on the call today, and we're really excited for this topic, and we're excited for the information that will be presented. And of course, we're always pleased to bring you Michael Osterman from Osterman Research. Under his direction, we'll be discussing why migrating to an Archiving 2.0 solution is necessary. Michael is an industry expert and is the president and founder of Osterman Research. He has over 27 years of experience in the high-tech research industry, and has spent 16 of those years following specifically messaging and collaboration. Just a couple of items to take note of. We will have some time for questions and answers at the end of this webinar. So if you have questions as we're going through, please feel free to put those through in the chat or the Q&A panels there that you see in WebEx, and we'll make sure to take some time at the end to address those questions. So we'll go ahead and turn the remainder of the webinar over to Michael. Let me get him unmuted and turn the rollover presenter to him. And Michael, the time is yours.
Well, Q, thank you very much, and I'd like to thank everybody who's here with us on the call today. Archiving is really a critical best practice, and it's a topic that really should be top of mind for just about every decision maker out there in the context of protecting data, protecting your organization, and mitigating the risk. And today we'll be talking about maybe a new way of thinking about archiving, different than you may have considered it before. So just a little bit about Osterman Research so you can get a level set on our perspective in all of this. We're an independent market research and consulting firm, and our focus really is on the way people communicate and collaborate in a workplace context. So we focus, obviously on archiving, but also around security technologies, encryption, authentication, content management, what have you. Basically any technology that will enable people to communicate or collaborate in a more effective way. We have a very strong emphasis on primary research. We'll be discussing a bit of that here today. We have our own survey panel of IT decision makers and influencers that we go to on a regular basis to get their opinions on things like archiving and security and so forth. The company is coming up on 15 years old, and we're based near Seattle. So, first and foremost, why do you archive content? And this is a question that really varies depending upon the industry you're in, the size of the company, the risk tolerance that your organization has, and so forth. And one of the things we find in our research is that a lot of organizations really don't archive. They will back up data, certainly on a regular basis, to protect against a server crash or to protect against some sort of this gross data loss, in case something really goes bad in the company. But they don't do what we consider to be true archiving, namely that they'll index all relevant incoming content, they'll put it into archival storage where it cannot be tampered with in the future, and where they provide robust search tools on the back end so that they can get at that data in the future for purposes of e-discovery or whatever the case may be. We did a survey recently with end users. It was earlier this month. And we asked them, how do you protect important emails, files, and other electronic content that you need to preserve for long periods? And what we found among end users, and these were mostly in mid-sized and large organizations in North America, is that 26% maintain their own archive of electronic content. It's not the organization that does it. It's not IT that has some sort of an archiving system. It's individuals that decide for themselves, I'm going to need this for a long period of time. I don't need that. And so they retain only the relevant bits that they need. We also found that 38% of organizations have their IT department archive important content for them, and then 31% use some sort of a combination of the approaches. So what we're finding is that in only about 7 out of 10 organizations is IT really involved in archiving content. That's really, what that means is that only about 70% of organizations are following what we consider and most consider to be a true best practice in preserving electronic content for long periods of time. Now, for those organizations that do archive, the primary reason they do it is to play defense. in case they have an e-discovery order, some sort of a regulatory obligation and so forth. They're protecting the data in case something happens in the future and they need to be able to produce content on demand. For example, if you, in the United States, if you get a sense that a lawsuit is coming, a product liability suit, a wrongful termination suit, whatever the case may be, you have to protect data from the normal deletion processes that normally go on in your organization. For example, purging email stores every 30 days or 90 days, what have you. You have a legal obligation to protect relevant data that might be needed for that lawsuit, even if the lawsuit hasn't happened yet. So you do have an affirmative defense or an affirmative obligation to protect that data. Also for e-discovery, if you ever are involved in a formal legal action and a court orders that you produce certain types of data, you need to have an archive of that data so that you can produce it. You need to be able to go into the archive, search for data that you can prove is authentic, and then present that to the court or present that to the other side in the legal action. Also, a lot of organizations have regulatory compliance obligations. Certainly all organizations have some level of regulatory compliance, but the primary industries that face the most stringent regulatory obligations are financial services, healthcare, energy, pharma, and several other types of industries. So, primarily archiving has been about defense. It's been about protecting your organization from risk, preventing deletion of data, preventing spoliation of data, and then all of the consequences that can go with that. So, today archiving is really a defensive play. And it's important to understand as well that regardless of the business you're in, data in almost every case is the most important corporate asset in your organization. Data is everywhere in an organization. As you can see here, this came from a recent survey that we did, and we asked IT decision makers and influencers, where is the data in your organization? If you had to go find it, all across the organization, where would it be? And certainly, file servers are the number one repository of corporate data. Just about everybody out there, particularly mid-sized and large organizations, has some sort of a file store, has file servers set up to retain corporate data and so forth. Email is also another major repository of corporate data, but also collaboration systems like SharePoint, users' laptops, users' desktops, their smartphones and their tablets, and then just in various other locations. For example, Dropbox and other cloud-based file sync and share solutions, various types of cloud storage, USB flash drives. I mean, data in an organization is absolutely everywhere. And so it's necessary to not only inventory that data, as we'll go into here in just a bit, but also to protect it, to archive it, to protect all of the business records and all of the relevant information within those content stores so that you can have access to it in the future. Another issue is that data has to be easily accessible, and one of the things we find in our research is that data is not easily accessible in many organizations. If you, for example, have to go through e-discovery or regulatory compliance or produce something for business partners, whatever the case may be, you have to be able to access the data quickly. You have to be able to access it efficiently and completely. If you go through an e-discovery effort, for example, and you can't produce all of the requested data, there can be situations in which a court can order a jury to assume that you're culpable if you can't produce all of that data. Now, that's not a common occurrence, but it has happened a number of times in the past, and the consequences for an organization that cannot produce all of its data really can be quite devastating. So, and it's not only the courts or regulators that you have to worry about, it's also employees. If employees have to go back into the archive to find old presentations or old financial projections or emails about what a predecessor said to your best clients, whatever the case may be, you need to be able to go back into those data stores, into those archives, and find that information quickly and efficiently. And now, a lot of times that's not possible. Organizations cannot produce data that they've been requested to or that employees are searching for. As I noted a few minutes ago, in many cases, archives just don't exist. Organizations will back up data for purposes of restoring a server, but not for purposes of producing information for end users on demand. And those, in many cases, organizations that do have an archive really don't have an archive that's efficient in terms of search capabilities. It's not very scalable. It's really not sufficiently powerful in many cases. There are a lot of legacy archive systems out there that just don't manage data very well. They weren't designed to handle the massive data loads that a lot of organizations today are seeing. And also, data tends to be stored in a large number of silos. As noted earlier, there are lots of different repositories for data, and very often an organization that has an archiving system will have just an email archiving system. They won't have something that will be able to archive data from file stores or smartphones or users' laptops or any of the other repositories out there. And those that do have other solutions for archiving tend to have these silos of information. They'll have an archive for email, maybe one for social media, maybe one for files, but these tend not to be very integrated and very accessible. And also, data is really not connected across the silos. And so if you have to do a search for e-discovery or some sort of a regulatory audit, then you're going to have to go into one silo to search for information, go into another one, and so forth. So there are lots of problems that make data relatively inaccessible in most organizations. Now, a lot of archiving systems, as I mentioned, are legacy solutions, and they're just really not designed to handle these massive data loads. They're not up to date in terms of the latest search technologies and so forth. And so what that means is that a lot of relevant data can't be found. And, as I mentioned, that can be very serious. It can have some dramatic consequences for organizations that go to court or go to regulators and simply cannot produce all of their data. Organizations have to be able to do that, and in many cases they can't. A lot of times it takes an inordinate amount of time to find all of the relevant data, assuming it even can be found. Many times it just can't be found quickly and efficiently as legal or compliance or others might require. Also, it just wastes a lot of employee time. If you have an archive that's designed for self-service for employees so that they can go back into their own archive, or maybe a departmental manager can go back into his or her employee's archive to search for relevant information or to search through the archives of employees who have left the company, it just takes a lot of time to find all of the relevant data. And finally, all of the consequences associated with that. A lot of organizations just can't produce the data, and so they can run into fines or sanctions or, just a variety of consequences that they really would prefer not to. Now, it's important to note as well that, archiving in almost every case, almost every organization has implemented archiving as a defensive mechanism. They've implemented it to protect, again, against e-discovery or regulatory issues and so forth. But it's important to note that you can consider archiving to be something of an offensive play. You can actually do more positive things with archiving than just mitigate risk in your organization. For example, if you think about an electronic archive of, let's say, just email, it contains an enormous amount of information about your company. For example, it describes all of the information flows between managers, employees, customers, prospects, suppliers, contractors, everybody in your supply chain. It's a record of every communication that has taken place, when that communication took place, and so forth. It tells you what employees are doing during working hours and after hours as well, because the vast majority of information workers will check corporate email when they're at home, on weekends, and so forth. An electronic archive also tells you how quickly salespeople respond to prospects' inquiries and how they respond to them, the tone of their language, the amount of information they provide, and so forth. Now, most organizations today have some sort of a customer relationship management capability, Salesforce.com or whatever the CRM capability is. But that CRM system contains only a relatively small fraction of the information about how salespeople interact with prospects and customers. It doesn't tell you, for example, how quickly a salesperson responded to a customer inquiry. It doesn't necessarily tell you, the tone of the response and so forth. So there's lots of information within your email archive that just doesn't get translated to any other system. An email archive, for example, also tells you how employees are treated by management, both in terms of the direct communication between managers and employees, as well as what employees are telling each other. And this is really critical. There's a law firm, Drinker Biddle, that has done an analysis, and they have found that the number one predictor of fraud in most organizations is the way that employees are treated. In other words, if an employee is treated badly by management, they are more likely to commit fraud against the company than employees who are treated well. You can find out how employees are being treated, at least through email communication, by having a robust electronic archive. That's something you're not going to really get through any other mechanism. Also, an email archiving system has information about information that is being sent in violation of corporate policies. Maybe information that's being sent in violation of best practices, or just simple common sense. Employees who are sending information to competitors, or they're sending sensitive information, maybe protected health information or personal financial information through the email system without encryption. If you have an email archive, you can do analysis on that content and find out what's going on in that context. And also, you can find out what employees are using to communicate, via email, social media, personally deployed applications, and so forth. There's a lot of information in an electronic archive that you're just not going to get anywhere else, and it tells you an enormous amount about your business, how your employees are working, and what maybe you can do to protect against the various risks that can accrue from improper actions. Now, the problem is that, yes, an electronic archive, assuming that you have an email archive, for example, it does contain this vast quantity of information, but most of the archiving solutions out there, particularly those that are 3, 4, or more years old, are just really not designed to extract meaningful intelligence from those archives. They have been designed to store information and make it searchable in support of e-discovery or regulatory compliance, or employ self-service to an archive, but they really were not designed to extract intelligence from the archive, to look at the relationships between people, to look at the timing of information, and so forth. And so if you need to do big data, if you want to do analytics on your email archive or other types of electronic content, you just don't have the tools within the context of that archive to be able to do that. And also, most employees really just don't have access to archived content in near real time. Very often they'll have access to older information, but not stuff that is relatively recent. And also, most organizations today just don't have policies in place that will retain all meaningful data. They have data, for example, that will be needed for e-discovery or regulatory compliance, stuff that contains, what today constitutes true business records, but they don't have policies in place that are going to retain all of this other information that describes how employees are interacting, the communications between employees and managers, and so forth. And so organizations need to have a capability that's going to enable the archive of that information and the ability to analyze it using big data tools, using analytics tools of other kinds, and so forth. So, a few use cases. For example, let's say you want to, analyze what employees are discussing via rumors. Let's say there's a rumor going around that, the company is going to be sold, that it's going to acquire another company, that, you're going to miss the stock price, analyst estimates for the upcoming quarter, whatever the case may be. Very often employees, particularly in a larger organization where they're not sitting side by side, where they can't hang around the water cooler, are going to be sharing this information through corporate email, sometimes through social media tools, sometimes through other means. If you have a good archiving capability that will capture all of this information, managers can go into the archive and really do analytics on what employees are talking about. Now, it sounds a little bit creepy because it gets into the whole notion of monitoring, but really what you're doing as a manager is due diligence on your organization. You're really understanding what's going on inside of it. And if you are finding information about rumors that are floating around in the company, employees are running scared that maybe there are going to be layoffs or whatever is the case, you can deal with that proactively. And you can squelch a lot of those rumors before they have a chance to really create problems for your organization. Also, as I noted earlier, employees who are treated poorly by their managers are much more likely to commit fraud. If you can go into an electronic archive and do analytics on that data and find out those employees who are being treated badly, as well as the managers who are doing that to them, you can more proactively deal with those issues. You can go to those managers early in the process and say, you're blowing it, you need to do something different, you need to apologize, or, whatever the case may be, and you can reduce the likelihood that fraud will occur in your organization from those disgruntled employees. Also, searching for evidence of inappropriate behavior. Employees who are sending, maybe racist or sexist jokes through email. They're sending information, to competitors. They're sending information without encryption. They're sending content that they really shouldn't have access to or that they have no reason to send through email. You can deal with all of those situations if you have a robust archiving solution that can deal with those issues proactively. The vast majority of organizations today simply can't do that. They don't have the tools in place. Many of them haven't even gotten to the point where they have an archive, let alone an archive that can help them deal with information proactively, do analytics on the data, and so forth. So step one is to establish an archiving policy in your organization and then to implement the right archive that will enable all of these capabilities. So next steps, certainly the first and foremost what an organization needs to do is identify all of their data assets. And that's something that a lot of organizations today simply haven't done. They have this massive store of data, multiple terabytes of data in many cases, or even more than that, stored all over the organization. It's stored in the cloud. It's stored on users' desktops, laptops, USB flash drives, smartphones, many times employees' home computers, and so forth. So first and foremost, identify where all of your data is, and identify the important stuff, the stuff that you really do want to archive. As part of this, you need to establish policies that are going to help your organization to retain data, the right data for long periods of time, and to retain it where it's supposed to be retained. Many organizations today haven't done that, and that's an important first step. Next, rethink your approach to archiving. Understand that archiving is the best practice, but it's important to implement the right archiving capability so that you can take that next step and get into a more proactive way of archiving. Archiving for the purpose not only of playing defense for rediscovery or regulatory compliance or simply preserving corporate history, but then archiving so that you can do analytics, so that you can apply big data principles to the data and extract meaningful intelligence from it. You need to enable easy search. Today, a lot of legacy archiving systems just don't have easy search capabilities. They're built, on an underperforming search engine, and you need to be able to enable that easy search so that organizations can have access to the data and then be more proactive with how they analyze it. And then finally, implement the right tools. Implement an archiving solution that will retain all of your relevant data. Now, certainly we recommend that organizations start with email. Email tends to be the low-hanging fruit for most organizations that are implementing an archiving solution, but certainly look at the retention of files, social media data, text messages in many cases. You want to retain anything and everything that is going to be relevant to the process of understanding your organization and extracting intelligence from that information. Okay, and that concludes my part of the presentation. Here is our contact information if you do have any questions. And Q, I'd like to hand things back to you now.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Great information, and thanks everyone for participating. Let's go through and see if we have some questions. Once again, everyone, if you do have a question, feel free to put those through in the chat or the Q&A panels there. Give me just a moment here. The chat. Okay, so we did have one that came through here on regulations. So, what regulations could affect what and how my organization archives?
Well, it's going to depend on the industry you're in. For example, if you're in the financial services industry and you're a broker-dealer, hedge fund manager, investment advisor, what have you, FINRA has some very strict obligations for the retention of data. For example, all email communications with customers have to be retained for many years. You have to retain social media data, information about advertising that you do, that kind of thing. If you're in the healthcare industry, you have to retain data on patients. In many cases, some regulations call for retention of data for the life of the patient plus 2 years. Medicare conditions of participation, for example, require a minimum of 5-year retention for data. If you're just in a fairly lightly regulated industry like retail or manufacturing, for example, you have to retain data that refers to employee records. So, for example, vacation requests, hiring records, that kind of thing, have to be retained for at least a year in some cases, sometimes 3 years in others. So there's a level of retention obligation for every industry out there. It's just that some industries have more stringent regulations and different different levels of aggressiveness, I guess, if you want to call it, for the regulators in that industry.
Great. Let's see. You talked about archiving social media a little bit, and the question came along of, can we archive something as personal as social media?
Yeah, that becomes a more sticky situation. Certainly if you are, if you have employees that are using something like Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, whatever the case is, on a corporate system, their corporate laptop, corporate desktop, what have you, you can archive that data. And yes, it's personal, but it's being used on a corporate system, and so organizations, at least in the United States and in many other countries, have a right to retain that information. Other countries, Germany, for example, has very strict retention obligations or retention restrictions, if you want to call it that, for personal data, and so you have to be cognizant of what those rules are in your country. In the U.S., though, companies are pretty much free to retain anything they want on a corporate system. The difficulty comes in when you have users that are employing their own smartphones, their own laptops, to do company work, when they're accessing, for example, corporate email on a personal device. That's where it becomes very sticky. And what we recommend is that organizations have a way to segment that data so that there's a work side, there's a personal side, and that the work content can be retained, even if it's on a personal device.
Great. One thing, too, that we just found out recently is that there was an update. Since we're talking about social media and regulations, just kind of wanted to mention this, that there was an update to the FRCP, the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, in December of 2015, and it deals a lot with social media, so it kind of goes along with that. And Michael, you probably saw that, but really the big thing is that it states is that social media is now considered, it gives equal. It's kind of considered equal to other types of electronic communication. So the actual quote is, social media evidence is given at least equal weight and important as other forms of ESI, such as email and documents. So, yeah, kind of what we were saying in the thing, social media is something that's important to archive as well, and the FRCP applies to anyone.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, the FINRA made that determination back in 2010 in their regulatory notice 10-06. They basically, the gist of it was bits are bits, whether it's email or social media or instant messages, it all has to be retained. And the FRCP, as you noted, has followed suit, saying that, whether it's an email or social media or a file, it's all, potentially relevant content, and so it has to be preserved. And we're finding more and more cases, we're going to be publishing a white paper shortly, that are looking at social media in the context of its e-discovery capabilities, or potential, I should say, that the courts are saying social media is just as relevant, and it has to be produced just like you'd have to produce email or files.
Perfect, great, and that kind of leads to the next question that someone had, and that is, what about mobile device archiving? Do you have advice for that? Like, what are some best practices there for archiving that, and especially when it comes to BYOD?
Yeah, we recommend that organizations implement a mobile archiving capability. As shown on a previous slide, about 6% of corporate data is stored on a mobile device. Employees have become much more mobile, using smartphones, tablets, what have you. And a lot of corporate data is just sitting out there on a mobile device. And so you have to be able to archive that. And it's not just that a mobile device contains a copy of what's already on a file server or in a file sync and share solution that somehow is managed by the organization. A lot of that content on mobile devices just isn't duplicated anywhere else. For example, a traveling employee that creates or modifies a presentation or sends an email from their smartphone or tablet, and then stores it in a personally managed file sync and share solution like Dropbox. That's content that's owned by the corporation that needs to be retained in some sort of an archive, but that never hits a corporate file server, for example. And so you have to have a mobile archiving capability that can archive all of that content as well, because it's about 1 out of every 16 bits in the typical organization.
Perfect. That looks like all the questions we have for now. Once again, if there were any questions, feel free to put those through, but that looks like all of them. Thanks again, Michael, for the information, wonderful information. Just a quick reminder for everyone on this call, we talked a lot about archiving and legacy solutions versus archiving 2.0. Guava does offer a solution with Retain Unified Archiving that is a wonderful archiving 2.0 solution, and it supports all the platforms that you see there on the screen. If you want more information about that solution, we have other webinars where we talk about that, and then you can also visit us at guava.com. Once again, thanks to Michael, and thanks everyone for being here. And this webinar is recorded, so you will be receiving a link to the recording. And of course, everyone on this call will be getting a copy of the white paper that goes along with this webinar as well. So once again, Michael, thank you, and thanks everyone for being here.